Hello, and welcome to Teaching Faculty 101. I'm Drew Hilton, a professor of the practice at Duke University in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. Today, we're going to talk about some terms and ideas that are useful for teaching faculty. Some of these will be relevant to all faculty, but we're going to focus on teaching faculty. This should get you ready for upcoming CRAE panels and workshops on teaching-focused careers. Those panels and workshops will have much more in-depth discussion of a lot of important material, but the panelists might talk about some of these terms, and it will be useful for you to know what they are already going into those panels and workshops. Let's start with what you do as teaching faculty. Obviously, your primary task is teaching. Beyond that, however, it depends. Most teaching faculty roles involve some other components such as service, research, outreach, entrepreneurship, and/or scholarship. We'll talk about those other components in a few minutes, but let's start by talking a little bit about teaching. First, let's start with a few key terms about teaching. Your load is how many courses you teach in each semester. So if somebody says, I have a 2-2 load, that means I teach 2 courses in the fall and 2 courses in the spring. Teaching loads vary across different universities, different departments, and even different positions within the same department. So when you're evaluating teaching positions and wanting to know what your teaching looks like, talking about the load is an important aspect of that. A course release is when your load is temporarily reduced, generally due to something else you're doing. So you might take on a large service obligation or be designing a new course, and you might get a course release where instead of your normal 2-2 load, you teach a 2-1 load. A prep is a distinct course, as opposed to having 2 sections of the same course. So if you say, I'm teaching 2 distinct courses, you might say, I have 2 different preps. And that would be very different in terms of the work you have to do beyond 2 sections of the same course. There's a lot of work beyond just your time in the classroom, which we'll talk about in a moment. A new prep is a course you have never taught before. Generally, this takes a lot more time to prepare, even if you get good materials from somebody who's taught it before to work from. You have to brush up on all the material, understand what's going on, see what's going on in the assignments. There's a lot that happens. And even more work than that is designing a new course, adding a new course to your department's repertoire where nobody's ever taught it before and you're making all the materials from scratch. So what goes into teaching a course? Many people think of the time in the classroom, which is important, but is generally not where most of your effort goes. And this may be lecture. Traditionally, in the past, lecture has been the main avenue, but these days we generally focus a lot more on active learning pedagogies, so whatever you're doing, you have some time in the classroom. That requires you to have some materials ready to go in, whether they're lecture slides, activities for the students. Before your class, even if you have good materials to work from, you generally need to go over them, make some updates, make sure you're aware of what's coming up, and that takes you some time. You also need to give help to your students. This could take the form of office hours, answering questions on class forums, one-on-one help, maybe with students who need to set up meetings for particular problems, situations, or just are struggling a lot. And you need to generally write exams, assignments, etc. Sometimes you might be able to reuse some assignments, but generally exams, you need to write new ones every semester because the old ones will get out there. Now you might say, but I'll have a TA for a lot of this, or many TAs. Well, that's great, but that also adds to the administration and logistics you have to do. You have to manage all those TAs. You have to run TA meetings where you make sure they know what they're supposed to be doing. You have to stay on top of them and make sure they're getting their work done. There's a lot of administration and logistics that you have to do, especially as your class size grows. You might have to do some LMS management. This is your learning management system such as Canvas, Sakai, Blackboard, where you're posting materials on there, uploading things. You might get your TAs to do some of that, but you generally will have to spend some time teaching them how to do it unless you can get your TAs many years in a row. And then there's grading. Again, your TAs might help you with this, but ultimately the grades are your responsibility. You might have exam grading where you and your TAs are in a room with some food, but you're still working on grading while they're helping you. You might have to regrade things that students have disagreed with the TA's grading of, and at the end of the semester, you're ultimately responsible for the final grade calculations and uploading to the registrar's office all the final letter grades. We talked earlier about how a distinct class, a prep, is a lot more work. And I've circled here items that are independent of the number of students. So every distinct class you're doing, you're going to have to do these things more. You're going to have to prepare materials for 2 different classes. You're going to have to manage 2 different sets of TAs. You're going to have to submit grades for 2 different sets of courses. That's not to say that the number of students in a class isn't important. It is. And even though I've only circled a few things here that scale with the number of students, these are generally very large components of the class, and so the more students you have, the more work it is also. So even though we talk about teaching load in terms of just courses per semester, how much work a course is can vary a lot based on the number of students in it, and whether or not you're doing another of the same course where you can overlap some of this work. So what happens beyond teaching? Well, these areas of service, research, outreach, entrepreneurship, and scholarship may or may not be parts of your teaching position at different schools, at different departments, in different particular titles, and how they vary greatly across those things. Most faculty roles have some sort of service obligation. This is work that's useful to your department, school, university, or profession that's not teaching or research, but instead is getting stuff done to keep things running. For example, you might serve on a departmental committee, like you might serve on your undergraduate curriculum committee where you review requirement changes to the undergrad curriculum, new course proposals, things like that. You might serve in an administrative role. For example, you might be the director of your master's program where you have to oversee that whole program. That's service to the department. It keeps things running administratively. You might participate in hiring. You might serve on a search committee. You might attend candidate talks and give feedback to the search committee about what you thought of different candidates. You might provide co-curricular support to students. You might review their resumes and give them feedback. You might conduct some practice interviews for them to help them get jobs. That's all things that help the students, but it's not really part of your teaching of a course. Or you might do service to the broader professional community. You might review research papers. You might conduct professional development workshops. Any of these things where you're helping people in your professional community are service, and they may count to some of your service obligations. Research is another thing that may or may not be part of your teaching faculty role. How much research is done and how it's valued varies greatly from role to role. Some teaching faculty roles may require or strongly encourage it. Some might say, yeah, you can do this if you want, but you don't need to. And some might say, look, this isn't a part of this role. You could do it on the side maybe, but it doesn't count towards your reappointment or promotion or anything like that. Depending on your role, your research might be technical. For example, I do computer architecture research published in venues like MicroISC and HPCA. Other research might be educational, pedagogical research published in venues like SIGC, IDISI, CompEd, things like that. Educational research is generally more common in teaching faculty roles, but again, what is allowed and how it's valued varies greatly from role to role and school to school. Other things that may or may not be included in your position are outreach, entrepreneurship, and scholarship. So outreach is where you help your local community. For example, if your local high school has a robotics team and you mentor them, that's outreach to the community. If you start a business, generally something around your technical expertise, that's entrepreneurship. And if you go create other educational materials, like you write textbooks or make online courses, that's other scholarship. And some of these may be important components or valuable components of a teaching faculty role, and in other teaching faculty roles, they may not be included. So now let's switch gears and talk about money. After all, that's why you want a job, right? Faculty salaries are structured differently than any other salaries that I know of. If you go into industry, they just tell you your salary, you get paid some amount every month, and it's pretty straightforward. Maybe you get a bonus. Faculty salaries are 9-month salaries that reflect the 9 months of the academic year. Generally, if you want to and can find the funding, you can fill in the other 3 months to get your full 12 months of salary. Now, many schools will pay out your 9-month salary over 12 months, even regardless of whether or not you have summer funding. So you basically get 3/4 of your paycheck every month over 12 months. And if you have summer funding, you get bigger paychecks in the summer. Does that sound really confusing? Let's just make a specific example to understand it better. This is something where the exact details vary from school to school, but I'm going to just set some specifics to clarify it. So let's say that your 9-month salary reflects 1 month each for September through April, the academic year, and 25% effort from May through August. So many schools will set it up this way since you're expected to do some stuff in the summer even if you don't have summer funding. Your 9-month salary is paid out over 12 months, and you can receive the other 3 months, so 3/9 of your base salary, over the summer, with 3/4 of a month in May, 3/4 of a month in June, 3/4 in July, and 3/4 in August. So let's put some concrete numbers here. I just picked 108,000 to keep the numbers simple. Let's say that's your 9-month salary. Your monthly paycheck all year, if you don't have any summer funding, would be $9,000 minus whatever taxes and withholding. So 108,000 divided by 12. We take that 9-month salary, we just pay it out over 12 months. One summer month, 1/9 of your salary would be $12,000. So that's just 108,000 divided by 9. In May, June, July, and August, if you have full summer funding, you can take 3/4 of that summer month, that is 3/4 of 12,000, and add it to your base 9,000 to get an $18,000 paycheck. This is a lot bigger than your normal paycheck and reflects that summer funding. Note that this means that if you have a full year with full summer funding, you get $144,000. This is 12/9 of 108,000, or you can also see that it's 8 months where you get a $9,000 paycheck plus 4 months where you get an $18,000 paycheck. So summer funding makes a huge impact on how much money you get to take home each year, but you have to come up with the funding for it. So where does the summer salary come from? Well, it can come from a variety of different sources. One of those could be grants. If you go put in a grant to do some research, this reflects your effort in that project. It's very common to include summer salary in your budget proposal, and this could be federal grants like NSF, or it could be industrial grants from tech companies that are interested in your area of research. You might get summer salary for large or extra service to your department or school. You might take on maybe one of those administrative roles and say, I'll direct the master's program for 2 summer months each year, right? That would be something you could negotiate as you take on that role. You might have startup funds. So generally when you start a faculty position, you get an account with some money in it. And research startups are generally quite large. You shouldn't expect things of that size. Teaching faculty startups are generally much smaller, but you might have some money or some summer funding in that startup funds that you could use. Faculty also generally have a discretionary account. This is an account that you can keep money in that you can use for any valid business purpose. Discretionary funds are the best funds because they never go away. So grants come to an end, and then any money that's not spent you just can't use anymore. But money in your discretionary account you can generally keep for as long as you're in the position, and you can use for generally any valid business purpose. This may or may not be the same as your startup fund account, but anything you have in your discretionary account you could potentially use for your summer salary if you want. But wait, it gets a little more complicated. Let's just say you have $12,000 in your discretionary account, and remember that our example summer month was $12,000. Can you pay yourself a full summer month? It would seem like the answer should be yes, but you know that since I'm asking the question, it's got to be more complicated than that. There's this thing called fringe, which covers things like your health insurance, your other benefits, whatever other stuff comes, like costs are associated with you that isn't just your paycheck. And the rates for these vary by school, but just as a reasonable example, let's say it's 25%. That means you need to take your one summer month, multiply it by 1.25, and you need to spend $15,000 of discretionary funds to pay yourself $12,000 of salary for your summer month. Now, what if this comes from a federal grant? Well, now you have a thing called overhead on top of that. Overhead, or indirect costs, are how your university pays costs that are associated with the research, but that can't be directly charged to the grant. So for example, if you have staff that manages the finances of grants, it's really hard to say, okay, this person spent this hour on this grant and this hour on this grant, so instead they're part of the indirect costs. Again, the rates are going to vary from university to university, but 60% is pretty reasonable as an example to use here. So again, we take our summer month, we add fringe, but now we multiply that by the overhead or indirect cost rate of 1.6, and we see that it costs us twice as much. We need $24,000 in our grant to pay ourselves $12,000 of summer salary. Now, if you're thinking, this is a complicated, how am I going to keep track of all of this while teaching people and conducting research and so forth? Generally, there's staff support, a grant manager or a similar title like that who help you with all these details. They help you budget your grants. And so don't worry too much about this, but you should know that there are these ideas of fringe and overhead involved in the costs of paying salaries. So now you know the basics. You have some basic terms and knowledge, and you can discuss teaching positions in ways you might not have been able to before this. So if somebody says, oh, this position has a 2-2 load, but you get one course released in the first year to design a new course, you'll only have to do one new prep per semester, and after the first year, only one new prep per year. You know what all those words mean and can understand what that has in terms of your workload of teaching. Also, if somebody says your startup will be 2 summer months plus $10,000 discretionary dollars, you can think about what that means in terms of your ability to pay summer salary and to use those discretionary dollars for either summer salary or other things like conference travel. With that, you're ready to dive into the upcoming CRAE panels where the panelists might use these terms. Hopefully you found this useful and are ready to explore your interest in a potential teaching faculty career.